Welcome to the Richie Show, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Heidi Klessig. Dr. Heidi Klessig is the author of The Brain Death Fallacy, which documents her own experience with a false brain death, as well as the history of the medical discussion going back since 1968, and how that has evolved today. Even the question of so-called brain death has been subject to corruption and the profit motive, and the hunger of the medical industrial complex to get hold of organs. Perhaps unsurprising for those who have witnessed the forced mandation of certain medical products by the pharmaceutical criminal cartels since 2020, and their ruinous effect on the population. I would urge viewers to get hold of her book, as well as to subscribe to her website at respectforhumanlife.com. Links can be found in the description below, and I would urge you to subscribe to the show and hit the like button on the video, as it helps with the algorithm. On with the show.
The best estimate by leading vaccine producers is that it could take a year or more to develop, test, and manufacture a vaccine for the clade X virus.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. You know, is the price worth it? That the price, we think the price is worth it.
Richie Brown Show.
I'd like to start with my personal story because I think it gives, the reason why I am here. I mean, why is this old retired doctor sitting here talking to people? So I think that the story gives us some depth to that.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start then. So with brain death, can you explain how this issue has come to have such importance for yourself?
I was in my residency training back in the 1980s, and I came in one night for night call as an anesthesiology trainee, and my supervisor who was running the operating room says, "Oh, Klessig, glad you're here. We've got a brain dead man up in ICU, and we want you to go up and prepare him for surgery." And I was a little shocked. I knew somewhere back in the depths of my training, I had heard about brain death, but I really didn't have the facts to mind. And so I didn't want to look stupid. So I asked him, well, a brain dead case. Well, that's something new for me. Is there anything different I should know? And he just laughed and he rolled his eyes. He said, just be sure someone has actually declared him to be brain dead. You know how eager the transplant team can be. Well, that was not at all reassuring to me. So up I went, and meanwhile, thumbing through my Washington manual, before the internet, we had to carry an actual book in our white coat pocket, and I was reading up on what brain death exams and what brain death was. I got to the ICU, and I found a young man, and he was about my own age at the time. He had been in a motorcycle accident and had a terrible head injury, and yes, the neurologist had indeed declared him to be brain dead. So I went in to take a look at him, and my first thought was I was really glad his family wasn't in the room with him because, as an anesthesiologist, if you yourself have ever had surgery, we come in, we talk to you about the procedure that you're going to have, we examine you, we tell you about how we're going to keep you comfortable, and we talk to you about how we're going to be sure you wake up feeling as best as you can and pain-free, and we're going to be there for you. But, what would I have said to a family whose loved one wasn't coming back? So I was really relieved I didn't have to be confronted with that. So I went to see the young man, and I was surprised. He looked like every other ICU patient I'd anesthetized. And in fact, he was more stable than most. He had normal vital signs. He had a good blood pressure, good heart rate. His oxygen saturation was nearly 100%. I don't recall that he was on much as far as infusions. So I went to examine him, and he was warm. His skin was supple. He did not look dead to me, but at the time I was being trained to think like a Western medical doctor, and I believed my authorities when they told me that this person was somehow dead, even though he looked very much alive. So I went back down to the operating room, and I found the doctor who would be supervising me for the case, and I presented the facts to him, and he said, "Okay, what is your anesthetic plan of care?" So I said, well, I'm going to give him a paralyzing agent so he doesn't move during the surgery. Surgeons get really cranky when people are moving and they're trying to operate. And then I think I'll give him some fentanyl, which is a potent painkiller, which will blunt any blood pressure or heart rate swings that might damage his organs. And he looked at me and said, well, are you going to give a drug to block consciousness? And I was stunned. I said, why would I do that? Isn't he dead? And I'll never forget, he gave me this long look over his operating room mask, and he said, why don't you give one just in case? And he walked away. So, in my gut, I knew something wasn't adding up here. It didn't seem right to me. But at the time, you're under a lot of pressure, and there's an operating room waiting, there's a surgical team waiting, there's a recipient for those organs waiting, and there was, all of my authorities telling me this is the way we do it. So despite my doubts, to my regret, I went ahead and I brought the young man down and I gave him the anesthetic we had proposed. And I'm here to tell you, he reacted to the incision, to the bone saw, to the pulling, to the scraping. He reacted just like any other patient, and he required the same types and amounts of anesthesia as anyone else. And basically, I stood there and held him down with anesthetic drugs while surgeons basically dismembered him to death. And then I'll never forget the surgeon looking at me up over the screen and saying, "Okay, give him one more big breath and then we're done with you." I'd never walked away from a patient before. And I think, I stood there a moment. I believe the surgeon may have had to tell me twice, but again, I gave him a big breath and then he said, "Okay, disconnect." And I disconnected and I walked away. And, it never left me. I always felt that something had been wrong there. But, you jump back into the fast moving stream of your practice. I had another case to follow that and I just kept going. And as far as I recall, I don't believe I ever did another harvest. So they give those cases, of course, to the junior residents because, what can go wrong? They're already dead, right? As you progress in training, you get to take care of recipients who are very difficult anesthetics because these people are obviously very sick with their organ failure. But, it wasn't until later in life that I had time to really sit down and reflect about what had happened and research these things further.
Definitely an incredible story. So if we go back to like the 1950s and 1960s, because they basically have two definitions of death now, don't they? So back in the 1950s and 1960s, this suddenly became a thing for humanity. Can you give a little explanation as to how that came about?
Sure. People have been dying ever since there have been people. And it usually, throughout history, has not taken a doctor to tell you whether someone is dead or not. People have been able to declare death for thousands of years at home, on the farm, on the battlefield, by the absence of all the signs of life. All the systems have stopped working irrevocably. You become cold, gray, and stiff. You become a corpse. But there were a couple of changes in the 1900s. There was the development of the artificial ventilator that was able to continue to breathe for people who would have previously have died. And there was the modern ICU that was developed also, that was developing techniques that were keeping people from dying who otherwise would have been thought, to be absolutely beyond hope. The third thing that was happening was the development of transplant medicine. And in early days of transplant, people had, even since the early 1900s, they had tried transplanting, the kidneys of pigs and goats into human beings. But of course, without any knowledge of the science of tissue compatibility, those very quickly were rejected and failed. In the 1950s, a doctor did successfully transplant the kidney of a twin into his twin brother. And this transplant, because of the tissue compatibility, did rather well. So whereas people wanted more transplantable organs, there were very few good quality organs available. That's because when a person becomes biologically dead, when circulation stops, that loss of oxygenation to the organs very quickly causes them to break down and they become unsuitable for transplant. Then in 1967, Dr. Christian Barnard in South Africa performed the first heart transplant. Now, there was some kind of shady things going on with that. He and his brother were operating. They found a woman who had been in a car accident. And at the time, they told the public that Denise Darwell's heart had stopped. But later, Dr. Barnard's brother admitted that actually it hadn't stopped. When they brought her to the operating room, they stopped it with a shot of potassium because they were rather worried that they would be faced with a murder charge for removing someone's beating heart. That made big headlines across the world. And then Dr. Barnard did a second heart transplant. On New Year's Day in 1968, a young black man named Clive Haupt suffered a brain bleed while out picnicking with his family and was brought to Groot Schuur Hospital in South Africa. The transplant team put a good deal of pressure on Mr. helps Dr. Hoffman, to declare him dead with a beating heart because, as long as the heart is beating again, the circulation is providing oxygen to the organs and everything's kept in very good shape for a successful transplant. Well, Dr. Hoffman was uncomfortable with this idea of declaring someone dead whose heart was still beating. And the quote he gives in an article he wrote, he says they came to him, Dr. Barnard's team, and said, "God, Bill, what kind of heart are you going to give us?" Meaning if you let this heart stop, it's going to be no good for transplant. So under this pressure, his doctor did cave and declare him brain dead. And they took that beating heart and put it into a retired white dentist. And that transplant was very successful. This man lived, for over a year. So everyone around the world is paying attention to this. And so a committee was convened at Harvard Medical School in January of 1968, just after that second transplant. And 13 men decided that they could redefine certain comatose people as being dead already, just by the stroke of a pen, by fiat. There were no tests, there were no studies, there was no evidence that these comatose people who had up until then always been considered to be alive could now be somehow designated as being dead. But they gave utilitarian grounds for this change. They said these people's lives were a burden to themselves and to others. And they said that by redefining them to be dead, they could remove the controversies surrounding organ harvesting and donation. And in fact, this redefinition was very useful to them because now doctors could take organs out of people who still had a beating heart without being sued. This was a very important way to circumvent what's called the dead donor rule, which says you can't actually kill people by removing their organ.
This was 1968.
That's correct.
And in that, they used, because I was reading through your book, and they used coded language to signify that's essentially what they're doing, wasn't it? Because they were trying to basically skirt around the issue of death so they could get hold of organs.
Yes, they actually, changed the language that they initially proposed because it sounded too much like they were showing their hand that the whole reason behind why they were making this redefinition was for the purpose of recovering salvageable organs. So they changed the language to make it seem a little bit more fuzzy, as if their concern was for the burden on families and on people. As if I talk about it, as if it was Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol, right? If they're going to die, let them die and get it over with, right? They had a very utilitarian view of people.
Yeah, the Malthusian worldview is definitely prominent even today. Is why do doctors administer an anesthetic to a supposedly dead person?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? And it's a good way to help people understand that what they've been told about brain death is perhaps not exactly true. So many people tell me, well, if I'm dead, why should I worry about donating my organs? I'm dead, right? Well, the answer is no, you're not dead, but you've been redefined as dead. And there's a book out by Doctors Franklin Miller and Robert Trug. They are doctors who are advocating being more honest with the public. They would like the public to know that these people aren't dead. But their solution is then to say, but, we do want these organs. So we think we should redefine medical ethics at the end of life so as to allow organs to be taken from neurologically disabled people. But they cite in their book a study of UK anesthetists, and they asked, do you give an anesthetic to a brain dead organ donor? And the participants, the respondents to the study, fell into two groups. The first group said, these people do respond to the incision just like anybody else, and they could have some consciousness left. So just to be on the safe side, yes, we give an anesthetic to these people. The other half, interestingly enough, they disagreed. They weren't going to give an anesthetic, but surprisingly, their position was not based on any concern for the patient. It was because they thought if the public learned that anesthetists were giving an anesthetic to brain dead people, the public might very reasonably discover that these people actually are not dead. And that's the reason you need to give an anesthetic. I tell my story of my patient that I cared for during my training to a pathologist friend. And she says, Heidi, as a pathologist, when I remove organs in the morgue during an autopsy, I don't have to give any of those drugs. Dead people don't need anesthesia.
Definitely. The science of neurology has identified the cerebral cortexes containing the function of consciousness and awareness. Medical professionals are all taught this, and their movements, facial expressions, and vocalizations are just reflex. Can you expand on why this is insufficient?
Sure. Interestingly, doctors have no ability to test whether you are aware. We can only tell if you are able and willing to respond. So we don't have any tests for this. And it's been passed along through medical training, this idea that the cerebral cortex is responsible for consciousness, when in actual fact, there is no medical data that that is the case. Dr. Alan Schumann studied a group of children who had been born without a cerebral cortex. And these children showed that they would laugh, they would smile, they would giggle, they would respond to music. One little fellow learned to scoot himself out through the porch door to enjoy the sunshine. They were certainly conscious, even though they did not have a cerebral cortex. And when people look and study the brain, they find a lot of things, but no one has ever found abstract thought or reasoning localizable to the brain tissue. In fact, it appears that our conscious awareness is part of our immaterial nature. I meet very few pure materialists in my travels. Most of us understand that we are sort of a tight union of the immaterial and the material. And the soul, the spirit, the life principle, being married to a physical body is what makes a human being. And it's that departure of the soul, spirit, life principle that is associated with death, of course, too. But the cerebral cortex has really nothing to do with our conscious mind, our abstract reasoning. So this is another reason why testing the brain is an inadequate way to talk about death. We need to be thinking in more metaphysical terms. Again, when the soul, the spirit, the life principle departs, is what is correlated with that loss of functioning of the body. The body no longer cooperates with itself as a unified whole and begins to break down. Unfortunately, we do not have any way to measure the immaterial. We can't see or visualize when the spirit departs. And so that's why I think it's important not to use these, utilitarian neurologic-based definitions of death, but to stick with what has worked for millennia, the loss of heartbeat, the loss of breathing, the loss of the coordination of the body as a whole. I like my dead people cold, gray, and stiff. Thank you very much.
Do you find a lot of physicians have that kind of utilitarian kind of material approach to this question?
I'm interested when I speak to physicians, how many have a very similar response to mine. Doctors, nurses, they cannot possibly personally investigate everything they are taught. The amount of knowledge that they're responsible for is simply too vast. So most of the time when I speak, and I talk to doctors groups all the time. I'm giving a medical grand rounds in a couple of weeks for a group of physicians. Most of the doctors are like, I always thought that seemed wrong. It didn't seem right to me, but that's what I was taught. And if you listen to people's justifications for brain death, generally they're justifications founded on authority and the majority. Most of the doctors are doing this. The doctors in charge are saying this, and so it must be true. But when I pull back the curtain and I show the complete lack of evidence, the majority of doctors are willing to say, wow, thank you so much. I need to reevaluate this. I need to reevaluate my practice in light of this. There are a few doctors who have a very dogged belief that it must be true somehow. And I can sort of understand that because, if they admit to themselves that for however many years of their practice, they have been taking people that were neurologically injured and deserved their protection and consigning them over to be medically dismembered as the ultimate cause of their death, that's a hard pill to swallow. And I can see them working very hard to find ways to make that not be true. Very rarely will I find someone who gets angry with me when I bring up these things. And actually, I think of an angry response as something of a win because it shows me that this person has heard me and has understood me. And what I'm saying really should make people angry. Anger is the correct response. So I always think that person, whereas they might have an angry outburst at me personally for being so rude as to turn on the lights and show them the problem, perhaps later they'll think about it and they may come to a different conclusion.
Yeah, definitely a case of shooting the messenger, I think. Can you explain the significance of Alan Schuman's documenting of 175 people who lived after the declaration of death in 1998?
Yes, this was a very important paper. Dr. Schumann is a pediatric neurologist. He's retired now, but he was at UCLA Medical School. And the idea of brain death sort of rankled with him also early in his career. He was a proponent of brain death. And then he began thinking these things over and came to a different conclusion. And he has been the one who's done the lion's share of work exposing the lack of science behind this. So after the 1968 Harvard Committee declared comatose people could be redefined as dead, there was a sort of medical consensus that this was okay because, after all, they're very sick and they're going to die a cardiac death anyway very shortly. I mean, the idea was that probably within days to weeks, if you had a shutdown of your brain function, everything else would stop. So they sort of justified it based on the fact that this brain death idea was a bit of a prognosis, right, of death. You were going to die anyway. So Dr. Schumann in 1998 did a literature search and found 175 people who were correctly, according to every guideline, declared brain dead, but who did not die within weeks, days to weeks. These people, in fact, went on, some of them, to live for years. The longest living person from this case was a gentleman who had been declared brain dead after meningitis as a 3-year-old. He ultimately lived 20 years or more at home with his mother's care. It didn't take a hospital care to manage his situation. He grew like any little boy. He went through puberty like any little boy. He was certainly not dead. And so this really pulled the rug out from under the medical establishment because they had thought that the brain was sort of the master integrator of the body, without which everything would quickly break down. And Dr. Schumann's case series proved this was not the case.
Excellent. Though there seems to be a thing over the decades that they're having these discussions. And in 2008, they had a presidential council and they were appointed to study brain death. And quoting from your book, they wished to dispense with the term brain death as the council found this implied there were 2 types of death. They then chose the term total brain failure. Can you speak to this council's findings and what they mean kind of in layman's?
Yeah, this was very interesting. So Dr. Schumann's paper that we just discussed, it really made waves, so much so that this second presidential council in the U.S. was convened, and they were quite straightforward about what Dr. Schumann's data meant. It meant either, number one, we have to abandon the neurological criteria for determining death and just say brain death was wrong. We're very sorry. We're going to have to stop doing that. Or number two, we have to develop a new rationale for explaining why neurological criteria should equal death, because the old rationales obviously failed. Well, despite which of these 2 options seems more complicated, which one they chose, right? They decided they would call it now total brain failure instead of brain death because these people, again, showed loss of brain function rather than death of the human person. And so they came up with sort of an ability-based definition. They said this total brain failure would be the lack of our being able to do the fundamental vital work of being a human person. And without any real reason given, they said that the fundamental vital work of the human person is conscious awareness and breathing. Now, not all of the committee agreed with this. In fact, the chairman of the 2008 President's Council, Dr. Edmund Pellegrino, disagreed, and he wrote a dissenting report. And he said that, the only indisputable signs of death are those we have known since antiquity: the loss of sentience, the loss of heartbeat and breathing, mottling and coldness of skin, muscular rigidity, and eventual putrefaction as the result of generalized breakdown of body cells. And so he said, I've chosen to give priority to the welfare of the patient before he or she becomes a donor, on the grounds that harm must not be done even if good comes from it. No person should be sacrificed as a means for the good of another. This is a moral precept that recognizes the intrinsic worth of every human being. And in fact, the 2008 President's Council failed to accurately reflect scientific facts. Total brain failure is inaccurate because these people with a clinical diagnosis of brain death do still have certain brain functions. 20% even today of people who are tested still have EEG activity with a clinical diagnosis of brain death. And in fact, not many are tested anymore because the requirement of an EEG has been removed from the brain death guideline. So oftentimes, people will tell me, oh, but, he had a flatline EEG. I'm like, you know what? That is not always the case in a brain death. At least 20% still have activity. And then it's been found that over half, between 50 to 84%, still have part of the brain functioning. The part I'm talking about is called the hypothalamus. So there is not total brain failure in total brain failure. And these people also have ongoing metabolism. I mean, they digest food, they excrete waste, they have wound healing, they fight off infections. And I'm here to tell you, they have the same stress response to the incision to remove organs as anyone else. And these are all the work of self-preservation as a human creature. So the new justification really does not hold water.
And then in 2010, you had the American Academy of Neurology. They updated their medical guidelines for determining brain death in adults. These were based off diagnosis of an irreversible coma with who have no complicating factors but lack specified brainstem reflex and who fail to breathe following a specified apnea test protocol, may be declared dead by neurological criteria. Can you explain the problem with these AAN guidelines?
Well, the 2010 guideline purported to be based on medical facts and evidence and science. It says in their title it's an evidence-based guideline. But if you read their actual writing, they say that there's a lack of evidence, there's a paucity of evidence. That because of the poor evidence, clinicians have to be very careful applying these guidelines. I mean, throughout the guideline in the body of the piece, they admit there is really no evidence. The second thing that's a problem in the US, our legal declaration of brain death is based on whole brain death. Our law in the US, unlike the UK, where you have a brain stem legal definition of death, in the US, our legal definition is that you must have the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem. But no AAN, which stands for American Academy of Neurology, brain death guideline has ever been based on the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, okay? So the way doctors have been diagnosing brain death in the US has never conformed to US law. These guidelines only check the same three things that you all check in the UK. They check for coma, which would be unresponsiveness to the most noxious stimulus, loss of, they don't even check all of them, a handful of brainstem reflexes, and then no breathing with what's called the apnea test, where they disconnect you from your ventilator for up to 10 minutes to see if you're going to breathe. The apnea test has some issues, if I can take a little excursus with that.
Absolutely.
Think about, if someone has a brain injury, the problem is they're not getting adequate oxygen to the brain and they're not removing waste products from the brain. Disconnecting a person with a brain injury from the ventilator is going to make their brain injury worse. I compare it to, say, someone was having a heart attack and now you're going to ask them to run on a treadmill. It's absolutely guaranteed to make it worse. And people understand that. People in the literature say that there have been people who the first time, they disconnected and starved the person's brain of oxygen for minutes at a time, they did not qualify for a brain death diagnosis. But because of the horrible insult that that test itself gave them. The second time, now they meet the criteria. So actually an apnea test can make you more brain injured than you were before. So it is an unethical test. And when I talk to doctors, I say, you as physicians, you should have taken an oath not to do harm to the patient. The apnea test certainly harms the patient, and it's an unethical test, and you really cannot be doing this.
They updated the guidelines again in 2023. That is the AAN, the American Academy of Neurology. Explain the problem with these guidelines. So these are kind of the newest ones, aren't they?
Yeah. The newest guidelines, interestingly, you would think that they would have some new facts or evidence for this guideline. But in this guideline, unlike the 2010 guideline, which was sort of an ersatz, evidence-based guideline, in the 2023 guideline, they admit right in their methods section that because of the lack of high quality evidence on the subject, this guideline was made by a consensus of experts. Now, of course, they didn't invite experts like Dr. Alan Schumann, who might disagree, right? And it's sort of fascinating that they say that there's a lack of high quality evidence on the subject. We've been declaring people brain dead now for nearly 60 years. Wouldn't you think there would be some high quality evidence for it? But no, they continue to use the same triad. They test for unresponsiveness, which again is not the same as unawareness. Just because you cannot respond doesn't mean you're not inwardly aware. I mean, there have been cases like Zach Dunlap, who was a famous case in the States. In 2007, he had a severe head injury following a quad bike accident. He had brain tissue coming out of his ear when they brought him to the emergency room. He was very severely injured. But his cousin, not his care team, his cousin did not believe that Zach was dead, even though the helicopter was landing with the team to take his organs. Zach's cousin took a clasp knife and scraped the bottom of Zach's foot, and he withdrew his foot. Well, the cousin called the nurse over and said, "Look, my cousin is moving." And the nurse said, "Well, they teach us in brain death school that you can still be moving even though you're brain dead." So Zach's cousin gave him another painful stimulus, and Zach pretty much took a swing at him at that point. And then the nurse said, "Oh, that movement crossed the midline. Maybe there's something going on here." And thankfully at that point the procedure was called off. But concerningly, Zach, who thankfully made a full recovery, he's now, holding a job, he's gotten married, he's had a family. He reported that while he was supposedly brain dead, he could hear every word that people were speaking. He said he heard the doctors telling his parents, "Your son is dead. He's gone. There's no hope. No, he can become an organ donor now." And Zach said he felt angry, but he said, "I was unable to move. I was unable to speak. I was unable to sign at all that I was still here." And that's the concerning thing, especially for me as an anesthesiologist. Can you imagine if Zach had gone to the operating room? And again, unfortunately, some don't give these people a proper anesthetic. I mean, it's horrific to think, what he would have experienced. So again, unresponsiveness is not the same as unconsciousness.
Absolutely. The world stands on the precipice of catastrophe. From the ashes of crumbling empires, new tensions rise. In Ukraine, the flames of imperialist proxy wars burn hotter. In Palestine, decades of colonial oppression erupt into resistance and brutal reprisals. Across Asia, the spectre of great power rivalry looms as the US and its allies encircle China, desperate to maintain their waning hegemony. Behind it all, the contradictions of capitalism drive the chaos. The ruling class, desperate to maintain power, sows division and war to distract from their failures. Exploited workers displaced by continued wars, coups, colour revolutions and manufactured economic crisis are pitted against each other, while the rich grow richer off the spoils of the conflict. But the people are waking up. From the picket lines to the barricades, the oppressed are uniting. The path to peace lies not in the hands of warmongers, but in the collective struggle of the working class. Only by dismantling the systems of exploitation and imperialism can we avert disaster and build a world free from war. The choice is ours, solidarity or annihilation. The time to act is now. Thank you. Quote from your book, the Journal of Neurology recently declined even to discuss whether brain death was biological death because it is not, quote, it is not directly relevant to practicing neurologists who largely accept brain death, do not question its conceptual base, understand its legality, and routinely practice its determination as they are trained. A bit of a remarkable response, isn't it?
You know, Dr. Burnett has been an advocate of brain death through all the changes. You know, back in the early days, you know, he was an advocate of the brain as the master integrator. And then when that was disproved, he has continued to be an advocate despite, you know, the total lack of evidence. He's quite an ideologue. And this statement you just read really shows he doesn't really care that there's not a justification for this. He goes on to say, you know, we don't even need to discuss it because, you know, by the powerful effects of the authority and the majority, both logical fallacies, neurologists largely accept what they've been taught. So we don't even need to have these discussions. And not wanting to have the discussion is a big problem. And that's really what motivates me to speak to the public, because when I went to research this for myself, I was amazed at the amount of medical literature over the last 60 years with doctors, lawyers, philosophers, scholars strongly debating whether brain death was a real biological death or not. But the public is never informed. You know, the public hears nothing but slogans and propaganda, you know, give the gift of life. And I think that's quite unjust. So I do what I do. You know, I have books, I have a website, you know, I post on social media, I speak because I want to give the public a seat at the table, because after all, you know, they're the ones who, you know, are being asked to participate in this without any type of informed consent, and that's unethical.
Absolutely, yeah. My first coming across this was that Kentucky man that woke up, and I mean, yeah, my first thought was brain death. Surely that's how is someone waking up with brain death? It had a really big moment of cognitive dissonance until I started researching it, came across Byrne, and yeah, it goes from there that it seems to be a complete myth. You make a point that transplant centers are encouraging do not resuscitate orders on patients, then reviving them to retrieve organs. This is known as the normothermic regional perfusion with controlled detonation, the NRP-CDCD. Can you explain first this process and then the problems with it?
Sure. So, you know, over time, as people were receiving better care for neurologic injuries with seatbelt and helmet laws, there actually have been fewer people with brain injuries being declared brain dead. So transplant doctors have been looking for another avenue to obtain viable organs. And this was sort of rediscovered. They rediscovered the idea of, well, maybe after someone's heart stops beating, if we act quickly enough, maybe we could still recover organs. And so the acronym for this is DCD. It was originally standing for donation after cardiac death. But then when they started harvesting hearts from these people, it was fairly obvious that the cardiac wasn't actually dead if you can take that cardiac out and put it into someone else where it beats properly. So they changed the DCD to mean donation after circulatory death to kind of smooth over that little kerfuffle. So DCD, or donation after circulatory death donors, are not brain dead, but either they're not expected to survive or they have decided that their life is of such a quality that is unacceptable. So again, DCD people, it's sort of a choice that these people are being offered. But they're not being given all the facts. They say, you know, we can let your heart stop. And then once, you know, of course, if your heart stops, you must be biologically dead, right? Then we will do, you know, an organ retrieval after you have died. But the devil is in the details. You know, again, I've told you earlier that once circulation stops, organs very quickly begin to break down and become unsuitable for transplant. So DCD means that they will take you to the operating room. They'll remove your ventilator. They'll remove any drips or medications that you're receiving, and they'll wait until your pulse stops. At that point, depending on where you live, in the US, it's a 2-minute standoff period. And in Canada and the UK, I think it's generally 5 minutes. And I think Italy might be 15. It's sort of funny that depending on where you live depends on whether you're dead or not. In fact, Germany doesn't accept DCD donation at all. They acknowledge these people are not dead. So based on your geographic location, you may or may not be designated as dead. This is another problem. But to move on, so in the US, we'll go with us. After a 2-minute standoff period, to be sure your heart doesn't spontaneously resume beating, doctors begin operating. The problem with this is that everybody knows that people whose hearts have stopped from 2 to 5 minutes, we routinely can resuscitate these people. And if you can still be resuscitated, you were never dead. So these people are being harvested during a period in which resuscitation is still possible. They're not biologically dead, but a decision has been made not to resuscitate them. So I have a case report from my neighboring state here in the U.S. of Illinois, where a young woman with Down syndrome suffered a brain bleed, but she wasn't brain dead. Her prognosis was dire, and so her parents agreed that she could become a donation after circulatory death donor. They took her to the operating room, got her prepped for surgery, removed the ventilator, her heart stopped. They counted off 120 seconds on the clock, and then they started operating. When the surgeons were starting to remove her kidneys, they were horrified suddenly to notice there were pulsations in her aorta. Her heart had spontaneously resumed beating, and she began gasping for breath. Well, now what do you do, right? Out of pure mercy, they gave her an overdose of lorazepam and fentanyl, following which, her heart stopped beating again. The county coroner in this case actually called this a case of homicide. I mean, there's no way around it. What else are you going to call this? They started operating on her when she was not dead, when her heart resumed beating and she started breathing again. They overdosed her. So again, this is another way of showing you that these people are not yet dead. But it gets worse. It's hard for even me to believe they do this, but this is the practice you brought up with the question called NRP, or normothermic regional perfusion. The DCD protocol is quite good, but because of the delay involved, it gives a very poor quality heart if you want to remove the heart for transplantation. So doctors have come up with a clever way to allow the heart to be resuscitated. So if you're a DC donor, they go through the same protocol. They let your heart stop. They do the 2-minute waiting period. And then for an NRP donation, what they do is the first thing is they clamp off the circulation to your brain, making you effectively brain dead on purpose. And then they perform a resuscitation on the remaining organs. Such that, in fact, your heart will resume beating in your own chest. So it's really quite an interesting series of sleight of hand. I mean, they declare you dead because you are now dead after your heart has stopped. That's the cardiac definition. Then they clamp off the circulation to your brain. So now you meet death by the neurological condition. And then they restart your heart in your own chest. So now your heart is beating again, which negates the first definition of death under which you were declared dead. It's a lot of obfuscation. Now, I ask you, who would consent to this? That's why the patients are never told, but this is an expanding practice in the U.S. Half of the organ procurement organizations in the U.S. are using this technique. It is banned in Australia. People have been calling for a pause to its use. The American College of Physicians, the largest specialty medical group, I believe, in the U.S. and in the world, perhaps, is calling for a pause on this because of the ethical dilemmas it brings up. But nobody seems to be listening to these calls for pauses. The practice continues.
Can you give an overview of the case of Jahi McMath?
Yes. Jahi McMath was a 13-year-old girl with sleep apnea. She was embarrassed because of her snoring at night. She couldn't go to sleepover parties. She was nervous about surgery, but her mother and her family and her doctors said, Jahi, if we do this surgery, we take out your tonsils and we do a palate repair, you won't be so tired. You'll be able to focus on your schoolwork. And so she went ahead with her family and had surgery at Children's Hospital Oakland in California. After surgery, she began spitting up blood, and her mother said, we asked for the doctor to come, and I can't say for sure, but I believe in my heart if Jahai had been a little white girl instead of a black girl, I believe we would have gotten a little more care and attention. But sadly, she did not get the care and attention they were looking for. And shortly after midnight, Jahai had a cardiac arrest, and she was pulseless for about 10 minutes until they could fully resuscitate her. Um, so with this, she experienced a severe brain injury, and rather, than pursuing aggressive treatment for this little girl, the doctors sort of seemed to have put her on a different track, a track toward, becoming brain dead and an organ donor. And 3 days after her surgery, doctors told Jahai's parents, your little girl is now dead and she can become an organ donor. Well, Jahai's parents didn't believe this. I mean, looking around the ICU, Jahai looked like every other little child in the pediatric ICU who was getting better. She was warm, her heart was beating, she was moving at times. They did not believe as Christians that Jahai's spirit had departed. And so they challenged this diagnosis, and thankfully they were able to get the help of Dr. Paul Byrne, who has been a longtime advocate against the brain death diagnosis and has helped many people with this situation. He was able to get transport for her to go to the United States state of New Jersey. Of all the 50 states, New Jersey is the only state that has a religious exemption to a diagnosis of brain death. So the hospital in California required that Jahai be given a death certificate prior to transfer, and then they turned her over to her parents' care. It's interesting to wonder, why double down on this? Why make her get a death certificate? Dr. Peter Singer has written a paper about this case, saying that it might be that the state of California has a cap on damages for people's pain and suffering after the death of a hospital patient. So if Jahai were dead, the hospital would only be liable for $250,000 in damages for pain and suffering. Whereas if Jahai was alive, there would be no limit to what the hospital and its malpractice insurer would be called on to pay for Jahai's ongoing care. Jahai received very poor care during this legal battle and was actually not fed for 3 weeks in California. But when they transferred her to New Jersey, they were able to give her a tracheostomy so she could have a better ventilation. They put in a feeding tube so she could be fed. And while all this was going on, Jahai's mother noticed that when the harpist would come for music therapy, Jahai's heart rate would decrease. And then she would also notice when the mother spoke to her daughter, Jahai's heart rate would seem to calm down. So she began doing videotapes and began to video that when she asked Jahai to do something, Jahai would respond appropriately. Oh, Jahai did so well, she was able to be discharged from the hospital in New Jersey to an apartment where her family took care of her with some nursing help. And these videos were very interesting. And so two world famous neurologists, Dr. Calixto Mercado from Cuba and Dr. Alan Schumann, came to evaluate her, and they did new MRIs. And they discovered on MRI that really Jahai's brain stem, the part of the brain that is examined during a brain death American Academy of Neurology guideline exam, was obviously quite destroyed, but the rest of her brain really looked quite good. And now she had brain waves on EEG and she was responding. And so Jahai McMath is a documented case proving that someone diagnosed correctly according to the guideline. I mean, she had 3 doctors declare her brain dead. She failed 3 apnea tests. She had 4 flatline EEGs, and she had a no-flow cerebral blood flow scan. Yet, given time, medical attention, feeding, proper care, she improved. She was now, according to these neurologists, in a minimally conscious state. And as sort of a comical example, they would ask this young lady, Jahai, which is the FU finger? And she would respond appropriately. This child was in no way dead.
Incredible. How can families protect loved ones from premature declarations of brain?
It's very difficult because the legal structure is that brain death is death. And so when I advise about these cases, I encourage people that tell their doctor, why is this person dead? I think there's a great power in asking questions, saying, why is my husband dead when he has a beating heart, when he's maintaining his body temperature, when he's making urine? How can this person be dead? And again, most doctors simply haven't thought it through. The other thing I find helpful is if you can, please refuse the apnea test, because again, it is an unethical test and it makes people worse. The other thing is if you're in the States, you can point out that the American Academy of Neurology Brain Death Guideline does not comply with the law under the Uniform Determination of Death Act in the States. And this does leave doctors open to a lawsuit. And this can have a chilling effect on doctors' willingness to diagnose brain death. I've just been working with a case in Florida just this last week. And they asked me my advice, and I sent these recommendations. I said you could try to transfer her to New Jersey, would be the other thing, because you're not dead in New Jersey because of their religious exemption. Florida also, where this case was taking place, has a medical conscience law which protects healthcare providers from having to participate in a brain death case, but it has no protections for patients, which is unfair. So I've submitted all these things to the lawyers who are helping this family. And it was a young child who had a near drowning. And I just heard back yesterday that the hospital, which had been threatening to simply withdraw care because of the brain death diagnosis, has now changed their mind, and they're allowing the child to go home on a ventilator. So that's very good news.
Incredible. We've rapidly gone from kind of a Christian-dominated culture where people believe in a soul and that kind of thing to a very material one in recent years. We've got members of like World Economic Forum, like Yuval Harari, who's referred to human beings as hackable animals. What are your thoughts on the kind of the dehumanization in our culture today?
I think we're missing the point. I mean, what is the point? So many people today, we live such busy lives that we don't stop to question the big ideas, right? Are we here for our own personal peace, pleasure, and prosperity? Are we here for, just to get all the gusto out of life we can and forget everyone else? I don't think this is the point. I mean, if we go back to our Judeo-Christian roots, we're here to glorify God and enjoy him forever. We're here to love God and love people. I mean, we have to remember that, people are eternal creatures. This is someone who is going to live in eternity somewhere. And these people are valuable whether they're disabled or not. So I think we have to reevaluate, what is the big picture and get our eyes back on the proper focus.
People seem to be completely self-centered these days. A cult of individualism seems to reign supreme. You were discussing about how you were talking to a physician, you'd say, how are their heart is beating, they're producing urine, that kind of thing. And with this brain death, it's produced some absurdities, doesn't it? You have a couple of examples, like of Anne Hesh, who died on August 2022, and the LA Times reported her death, but the NY Times and the Washington Post waited until her organs had been harvested on August 14th to write an obituary for her. It's an absurd situation, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think people, when they stop to think about it, these things become obvious. Even the obituary editor of the Washington Post says, brain death, it's not death. We like to wait till they're really dead to publish an obituary. I mean, it shows that at a gut level, everyone understands this. But, I think none of us like to think about death, right? We want to put that off and not think of it terribly much. But, it makes sense to think about it now so you can make proper decisions and to have some ammunition ready so that should the worst day of your life come upon you unexpectedly, you're not totally unprepared.
What are your thoughts on the worldwide push for euthanasia? I mean, in Britain, we've just legalized abortion up until birth.
Yeah, it's really a disgrace. It shows how little we care for one another as human beings, and it's sad that the ultimate way of taking care of a person is to kill them. It seems very odd. It seems so strange to me that doctors are the ones who are being given this responsibility to withdraw life. I mean, historically, doctors have been prohibited from even getting anywhere close to this. I mean, I think it would almost be better if you're going to have these euthanasia laws to bring up a new profession of the public executioner. I think it would give people a better idea. They go to their doctor and they have a certain feeling that this is a caring person who's going to do what's right for me. But killing people is not medicine.
Absolutely. Heidi, I've kept you long enough. Are there any last thoughts you want to leave us with, and where people can find you to keep up with your work?
Yeah. I always like to close these by saying, I am not against transplant. I am against unethical transplant. And there is a way of doing this properly. I mean, living donation in which both the donor and the recipient remain alive after the procedure is a wonderful way of giving a gift to someone with organ failure. And you can give any organ, except the heart, of course, in a way that both the donor and the recipient remain alive after the procedure. And the good news is a totally implantable artificial heart is currently in clinical trials. The other thing I want to be sure and say is that, if you're a doctor, if you're a nurse, and have participated in these organ retrievals, if you have given a loved one to become an organ donor, if you have received an organ yourself, I want you to know it is not your fault that you were lied to, that you were not given these facts. I mean, like myself, I believed my authorities at the time. And so you made the best decision you could with the information you had available at the time. So I want to just end with a message of mercy. We need to be merciful to ourselves and others. Our culture has betrayed us, once again in this field as well. But we need to go forward telling the truth to one another in love and finding a better way forward. So if you want to find more information about this topic, you can take a look at my book, which is The Brain Death Fallacy, which is available on Amazon. My website is respectforhumanlife.com. Respect for human life. If you don't put the human in there, you won't find us. And this has a very large amount of information about all the different types of transplant. I really like our survivors page where we have the names, faces, and stories of people who are declared brain dead and survived. I'm on social media on X at Heidi Klessig MD. And I'm working right now. I'm in the middle of producing a series of short videos for the public. So if you want to share this information in a really easy, accessible way with your loved ones, that's on my YouTube channel, which is again at Heidi Klessig MD on YouTube. And you can find more information there.
Excellent. Thank you for your time, Heidi.
Thank you so much.